Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Major developments at Red Bull Racing, potentially very positive news for Max Verstappen after serious questions in recent weeks as to what was going to be happening with his race engineer Gianperio Lambiase, but already talk with the new season still a good few weeks away on sandbagging. Teams apparently set to turn up in Barcelona with a very different car to the test in Bahrain and potentially a very different car to the first race in Melbourne as well. Which teams are going to be most the culprits for this, we'll discuss in the coming minutes. Remember to enter your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. Thanks to all those who have subscribed recently over these last few days. Let's dive straight in because the VF26 is next year's TGR, Toyota Gazoo Racing Haas, and they're going to reveal it slightly earlier than initially planned. I think we actually looked at some of the dates yesterday and Haas's launch overlapped with both Alpine and Ferrari. Now, if there's ever a day you don't want to launch your car on as another team, it's the day that Ferrari do it, because that's always a massive deal, especially because they have these fantastic launches where they actually drive their car around the track at Fiorano. So you don't want to clash with that if you can avoid it. Haas, I think, are doing their livery reveal just online, some sort of live stream type thing, whatever. We'll see what Haas come up with, but they've decided because of that, okay, we'll do ours a few days earlier. The first launches are in just over a week now. Red Bull and Racing Bulls set to unveil on the 15th of January. Then we have Haas after their recent change to the 19th from the 23rd, Audi, Mercedes, Ferrari, Alpine, and then the other teams are doing their reveals after the first test in Barcelona, but of course we'll probably see glimpses of those cars before then. But the key thing is, will they be the real cars? Because one of the key talking points of today is about sandbagging and what the teams might be hiding. Let's not forget in 2022, Mercedes turned up to the Barcelona test with a very different car to what they actually ended up starting the season with in Bahrain. They ran the much wider side pods. To find you guys a couple of images, these were the side pods they started out with in Barcelona, which you can't fully see, but you can see the inlets anyway, that on the left-hand side, that's what they were running, and on the right-hand side, that's what, of course, they ended up with once they, well, went down the zero pod concept when they turned up to Bahrain. Now, they thought this was going to be a major performance driver. In fact, it wasn't, as we found out as the season transpired, the porpoising issues that they ran into with this W13. But the point being that they changed quite a lot about this car, really. I mean, obviously very noticeable things as well between those two environments, mainly because they just didn't want to reveal and give any other team. If the Zero Pod was the panacea, if that was the concept to give the teams a huge edge in the regulation set, which of course it turned out not to be, but if it was, they didn't want to give the other teams an additional head start in catching up and figuring that out, right? The teams and the drivers were, very wide-eyed when they saw Mercedes roll out of the garage with that thing, and they did so later than they could have done in order to ensure that other teams didn't get the message. So this will be a similar thing in 2026. I'm sure that teams will have various ideas on what they want to do with their car. Now, there's engine stuff to discuss here as well, but we'll do this and then we'll talk about what Ferrari are doing with their actual chassis, because reportedly there will be, for some of the teams, especially Ferrari maybe, multiple versions of this chassis over the next couple of months. I think Paul Monahan at Red Bull basically said they're not going to do this whole Spec A, Spec B, Spec B plus or Spec C thing that some other teams are going to do. Whereas Ferrari, it seems, are. So their runway is make sure it's reliable, and then as we get closer and closer to the start of the season, then they'll start to show us what they were really working on. Because, of course, look, you want to test it, make sure it works on track, but you don't want to give the game away, as it were. And that's why there's a little bit of a toing and froing here. But the reality is that teams will be hiding things that they've developed in these upcoming few tests in Barcelona, and then, of course, following on from that in Bahrain. Now, Ferrari are also working on this engine. We've talked in recent days that they're running the cylinder heads in steel rather than aluminium would be the standard material that's been used in recent years. The feeling is, though, that weight is actually not a concern here. Now, I didn't realize this when we talked about it first, but actually the minimum weight of the engines this year is up quite significantly to what it used to be. The minimum weight of the car overall is down by 30 kilos, but the actual minimum mandated weight of the engine is up by nearly 30 kilos. So the engine has to be a certain weight, which means that using steel probably isn't a massive problem, but equally you don't want it to be heavier than necessary. So apparently they've created ultra thin, high strength cylinder heads that will not be any heavier than the aluminium, but will still gain an advantage in terms of how hard they can run their engine. Of course, the main question really is, can they run it that hard and still be reliable? That's the first thing they want to work out in the Barcelona test. But of course, they're also showing us the car on the 23rd of January at Fiorano. So what are they going to show us then? They're set to unveil the 678 at Fiorano before heading to the closed-door Barcelona test at the end of the month. The car running in Spain will apparently be close to its definitive form, serving mainly as functional and data gathering. Only the final aero package is missing, which is scheduled to debut on the final day of the Bahrain test, once wind tunnel work is fully translated into race-ready components. So, depending who you ask, there's a little bit more of a runway various teams are having, because that suggested that, they're not changing much, but the feeling is that Ferrari will have effectively a Spec A. That's just to test the reliability in Barcelona. There's then going to be a performance package on top of that for the Bahrain test with more aggressive aero. On the final day of those tests, they are set, or maybe the penultimate day, the day before the last day, they're set to unveil the actual full aero package that they're set to run in Australia, or maybe they won't and they will just bring that to Australia with a Spec B plus evolution. I imagine this will be a pretty similar plan for many of the teams. And look, there's a level of sandbagging, but there's also a level of, well, we're designing the parts right now, so we can't show you them where they've not been produced quite yet, because the level of development is going to be rapid this year. There is no doubt about that, and that will be the critical component of probably who wins this year's championship. The other piece, of course, is the engine, and there's quite a bit of talk about what Honda might be doing here. John Noble and the guys at the race say that, well, the ICE will be critical, but also from a driver perspective at least, deployment of energy and the ability to recover energy successfully will be a key part. Now, we understand that Honda have pretty much led the way on this over the last few years. Certainly, they were considered to have the strongest energy recovery system. Whether that will stay true in the new era is a good question. But there's also continued rumours on what battery they're going to run. So we did talk about this a little bit the other day. I think there was, it quote tweeted that original tweet. But a few days ago, we talked about lithium-ion batteries using liquid electrolyte containing lithium ions, or solid-state batteries. Now, solid-state using an actual solid electrolyte component, which can potentially yield benefits in terms of more recovery, higher concentration, can possibly charge up quicker and store more energy, full stop. The difficulty with that tech as it stands is power delivery on demand is not as high as using a liquid electrolyte. But apparently Honda's tech on this is pretty much as advanced as anyone is working on in the world right now. And there are some rumours that Aston Martin might be able to use a semi-solid state battery, because again, the rules are pretty lax in this area. You don't have to use the battery that everyone else is using. So if Honda have a more advanced battery that could be potentially lighter and also more powerful, this is where the tech is going. In the coming years, I think we will start to see this. Whoever gets there first might have an advantage. It might be Honda. It might not. We'll see. This was interesting. So Luca Fabato, who's their engineering director, he is at his 30th season in F1. He says this is the biggest change ever. And a couple of days ago, he boarded a Japan Airlines flight, presumably to Japan, to go and visit the guys at Honda. That may or may not be related to what's happening with this battery tech, but remains to be seen on that. Let's talk about the big development at Red Bull. So if you saw the talks a couple of weeks ago on this channel now, we were talking about Gianperio Lambiase, what's happened at the end of the season in Abu Dhabi, where he was visibly particularly emotional. We also talked about the personal reasons behind the scenes for why that seems to be the case. The question was, does GP want to stay in this role where he's doing 24 races a season, he's with Max every weekend, especially if there's an expectation that Red Bull are not going to be that competitive this season. He has stuff to take care of at home. Maybe he wants a role that's a bit more hybrid. there are some options on the table. Now, look, he had a contract through this season, but there was absolutely interest. And we talked a couple of weeks ago that, well, the rumours were leaning the way of GP was about to leave Red Bull because there were so many offers flying through. Aston Martin were apparently giving him a very substantial offer to join as a very senior role, probably with the intention to get Max Verstappen to join at some point in the future. But there's a CEO role still available over there at Aston Martin Formula 1 team that's not being filled right now because Adrian Newey is just the team principal for the time being. Some questions on where that could be. Maybe they were touting GP for that role or some other senior management role. We then heard rumours that actually Williams were also interested. They were talking to GP to see if they could find a role for him. They'd say, look, GP, come over here, we'll pay you more money and you can stay at home, right? Work at the Grove office, not worry about travelling to the races so much. That was an option. There was even then talk a couple of days afterwards that actually McLaren were interested and wanted to sign him as well, in addition to Rob Marshall, Will Courtenay, other key names they have scalped from Red Bull in recent years. So with those three key names, Aston Martin, Williams and McLaren, all fighting for a signature, it felt that it was only moving one direction, that it would be very challenging for Red Bull to come up with an offer good enough to match that, especially with what GP himself personally desired. Now, maybe things have changed behind the scenes, and look, he was clearly very emotional after Abu Dhabi, potentially for reasons similar to this, but obviously, he's got that phenomenal relationship with Max. They wouldn't want to break that up, I would imagine. So Eric Van Haren, he's very well connected with Red Bull and with the Verstappen camp. He says today that this is now off, as in this move is now off. So he is going to stay at Red Bull, at least for the time being. He was linked to other teams in December, but there were no plans to leave. He was linked to Aston Martin and Williams. As I say, there were some reports linking him to McLaren as well. However, he's got the contract and he will remain this season active as Verstappen's race engineer. Lambiase was very emotional after the final race. There's also why he missed the last couple of races the season before, and, well, the same applies the other way around, describing how important that relationship is. Van Haren does describe here how many of the key names near Max at Red Bull are leaving or have left. He's one of the Dutch World Champions' 4 permanent engineers. 2 of the group have since left. David Mart's gone to Audi, Michael Manning as well. Verstappen's performance engineer Tom Hart is leaving to Williams, and he's still got an ongoing contract and will remain active with Verstappen's team for now. But, I mean, look, these are just other names in addition to the Horners, the Marcos, the Neweys, the Wheatleys, the Courtenays, right? All these other guys that have left in recent years. And there's some additional ones as well, but probably the key name, because, look, if GP was to have gone, it's very difficult to imagine that Max would have stayed there too much longer. What reason would he have had to stay at that point, especially if the car isn't that great and we're not really expecting it to be? If Red Bull want any hope of keeping hold of Max, they absolutely had to keep hold of GP. And yeah, they've got a contract with him. It would require buyouts from those other teams, but maybe Red Bull have found a relationship which makes sense for the time being. So, look, this is not like an absolutely done deal. Okay, Max is there forever, GP's there forever. Like, no, Max has got a contract until 28. GP's got a contract until 27 as race engineer and head of racing. But there will be people knocking at the door. And of course, Max will also be looking out the window depending how that car performs when it turns up to the track. But big news that for Max. Personally, I also think, good news for GP as well that they retain that partnership. It's one of the most entertaining in the sport. I think good news for the fans as well. But also big news for Red Bull, right? Because securing GP staying around is critical if they want any chance of keeping on of Max. I don't think their chances of keeping on of Max are that high. If the car doesn't perform, there'll be too many tempting options out there for Max. But GP is staying around, at least gives them a chance to hold on to him, I think. So that's the key talking point from the day at Red Bull. Couple of other things to mention before we close out the video. I thought this is quite remarkable. These are the only longest active point streaks in Formula 1. Russell leads the way at 16 races. Obviously, the McLaren boys managed to get disqualified in Vegas, so that kind of put an end to all that. But Verstappen at 13 races and Leclerc at 3. That's practically it. I mean, that is it on the whole grid, which is, I think, pretty rare that we've seen numbers limited to quite that extent. The other thing I wanted to mention before we close out the video here was B-Sport put out a couple of videos in recent weeks talking about the 2026 regs. I'll leave them linked down below, but he said something very, very interesting, I thought, when he was designing this floor piece. Now, as you can tell, in this image, this edge of the floor here is designed to in-wash the air. So the wake comes off this front wheel and then it runs along the side of the car. Now, ideally, the teams like to push that air out using, you know, nice wide side pods and stuff so they can get that air out of the way. It's not going into the diffuser, it's not going into the beam wing. There's no beam wing in 2026, but it's not going into the rear wing or anything like that. Getting out of the way, and it's annoying the car behind rather than annoying the rear wing. But, of course, the regulators don't like that because it makes it harder to follow. So they're mandating this component of the floor, which is an in-washing component, right? You can see very clearly that it's designed to force the air to the inside, which makes it more difficult for the teams to play around with it. Now, B-Sport basically says the way that they've written these regulations is absolutely ripe for potential loopholes. And this is just one legality box. And this is one man spending about 30 minutes coming up with a solution, let alone a team of thousands of engineers looking at every single legality box and rule to come up with potential grey area solutions here. So just worthy to keep in mind, because what he came up with actually was this. So he goes into full detail in the video, I'll link down below, exactly why this is legal based on the way the rules are written. But effectively, you can use 3 different elements of this piece, and here they are very clearly designed as the FIA intended to channel the airflow inwards. But actually, this is a legal representation of what the legality boxes allow based on the curvatures and all this other technicalities. But effectively, teams may well show up with these leading floor pieces that look like this, which is actually doing the exact opposite, right? This front piece is channeling the air to the outside, creating vorticity that will, well, annoy the car behind, but generate better performance from the car that this is on. So, and this, as I say, was designed quickly by one guy. So, look, the point is, the regulators have a tough job on their hands, but there's not many of them compared to the might of these Formula One teams. And I think you can expect many a different solution this year that teams will be exploring. But also, when you look at these cars and like, oh, well, that's what 2026 cars are going to look like, you know, we can bet very strongly that they will, but not to a great extent. And teams will have all sorts of ideas for how they can abuse these areas. So that's also the question, right? That you've got talk about, well, there's going to be less downforce in a sense, so it should be easier for the cars behind to follow. But actually, the engineers probably from day one will have found ways to reduce that ability to follow a car in front further than what the FIA would like. And you can only imagine what it's going to be like as the years go on. So, yeah, thought that was interesting. Intrigued to your thoughts, as always, in the comments below. I'll just share one final thing, which was horrifically ugly. I thought was kind of interesting, but it's still just... Autosport put out this terrible graphic, really. I mean, it's quite aesthetic, but it's... And I appreciate it's not easy to do this. But what they've gone for is they're looking at every Formula One team and showing what they used to be called, right, in that spot. Obviously, they're not showing Cadillac here because they've only just come in, but it assumes, in the way it's designed, that every team has been around for the same amount of time. At least that's how it's read. So, yes, Haas have always been Haas since they have been in the sport, but they've not been around as long as Williams or McLaren or Ferrari, but it looks like Haas are some sort of like F1 giants that have been here for years. You got Red Bull at the top, of course, you know, formerly Jaguar and all this. And there was some attempt here, for example, with Renault and Alpine to show the length of time that it was certain iterations. That Renault logo is not perfectly centered, which is annoying me slightly. But it was Renault, and then it was Lotus, then it was Renault, then it was Alpine. But for Brawn are only around for a year, but yeah, they have like quite a substantial green slice, and it looks like Mercedes haven't been here long at all, right? Like it looks like Mercedes were here for about the same amount of time as AlphaTauri were here, but obviously Toro Rosso were bigger than that. Whatever, it's a graphic. It's actually quite useful to see what the history of these teams are, but it's probably not optimally designed. As I say, it's easy to criticize, isn't it? So very much enjoyed your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.